And I want to talk to you, Richard, as kind of a person who really reimagined what theater and performance is. And to start us out, maybe if you can take us back for a moment to the heady 60s. And I watched Dionysus in '69 last night, which you made with Brian De Palma filming it, a remarkable piece. Just to take us back to that moment when you start thinking about performance in a much more expansive way.
Well, it goes back a few years before Dionysus, which was in 1968. It was while I was at Tulane University, where I had my PhD in 1962. And the same year I became an assistant professor. And the same year I became editor of TDR. And even before that, in the 50s in Provincetown, Massachusetts, where I was running a summer theater, a very extraordinary summer theater, given that we were doing Ibsen and Strindberg and Ionesco and Genet, which is not usual, the usual summer theater fare. And we also did some environmental theater. And at that point, when I was finishing my graduate studies, and also during 2 years that I spent in the United States Army, between my master's degree and my PhD, and living in New Orleans, which is a fundamentally performative, I would say performative city. At that point, I said it was a theatrical city. I didn't have the word performative. I hadn't read Austen at that point. But in the 60s, I began thinking of what I call the broad spectrum, the expanded view of performance. And in 1966, I published an essay called A Look at Performance Theory. It's in my book, Performance Theory. Approaches was the name of the essay. And in that essay, which was published in '66, but which I wrote and thought about from the 1963, '64, I said that we should look at the total performance spectrum: play, games, sports, rituals, the performing arts, and performance in everyday life. So that laid it out. Of course, I was influenced by Irving Goffman, who wrote a book, Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. The book was published in 1956 in Scotland, but it was published in the United States in 1959. And somewhere in the early 60s, I read that book. And the second chapter of the book is called Performance. And I really took the word performance from Goffman. The word performance itself is a very multivalent word. We can use it to mean something very bad. You know, you're just performing. It means you're not serious, or you're pretending. Or it can mean something very good, like high performance, or how is the person performing in her job, or something of that sort. So the word itself is one of these broad spectrum words, or a slippery word, or a word that's hard to pin down. It can be bad or good. I was very attracted to that. And then also influencing me, this was before I met Victor Turner, were the things I saw in New Orleans, not only the street life and the French Quarter, where I eventually had an apartment and lived. I started uptown, but I ended in the French Quarter of New Orleans, and the mix of black and white culture. But what struck me, I was very active in the freedom movement. And I was one of the 3 founding producing directors of the Free Southern Theater. And we performed in churches and in schoolyards. It was called the Theater for Those Who Had No Theater. And it was during Freedom Summer and year after Freedom Summer, 64, 65, where in 1965 we did most of our summer performing, and we had a headquarters in New Orleans. And I was one of the 3. I was the white. I don't really consider myself entirely white, but leaving that out, I would be categorically set as white. And the other 2 partners were African American. And this theater, even though we did things like In White America by Martin Duberman and Waiting for Godot, which was quite unusual to play it before black farmers in rural Mississippi who really got it. You know, they knew what waiting was, they knew who Pazzo was, and Pearly Victorious, which is a kind of send 'em up satire by Ossie Davis of black-white relations. I saw that performance, and of course a lot of this was in church, so churches. So I also saw churches, and Goffman, the notion of churches, the idea that religious ceremonies were actually performances, that people were singing, they were dancing, they were worshiping. There was a kind of a religious experience that was, it opened my eyes to those possibilities. So all of that formed the kind of background for this essay, which laid out the framework. It still lays out the framework for what performance studies became. And then I was also, you know, this movie has just come out about the trial of the Chicago 7. And some of that, when we moved Tulane Drama Review to NYU in September, August, the summer of 1967. So we moved it to NYU, and became the Drama Review, TDR, which it still is. And I was editing it from 1962 to 1969, and I began editing again in 1985. But during that period, I was editing it, and the Chicago demonstrations, the Festival of Life, as it was called, TDR was the office for it. If you go and check the TDRs of those days, you'll see right to Festival of Life, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin at TDR. So we were the drop box, and I knew those guys, but I didn't go to Chicago. I actually went off to Latin America in the summer of '68.
Can I ask you something about this beginning? I really appreciate you saying your beginning of this story is you're starting in theater, actually doing work, but and you said in churches, community spaces for different people.
Right.
What I really like, and I have the book here, actually, Performance Theory. So this is the book where people can.
So the essay I'm talking about is the first essay in that book.
Yes. And I want to ask you something about the first essay in a minute, sort of what you talk about ritual.
Sure.
But before that, what I really like in the way I sort of understand what you're doing is there's a real joy you had, sort of real pleasure and sort of excitement in all ranges of performance. So it wasn't just what's on stage in a theater and kind
Correct.
of formally recognized, but this kind of energy or vitality. And so Irving Gottman and Victor Turner, we should talk about him a little bit, but they sort of recognize that all of like everyday life contains these elements, whereas academics had usually put them somewhere else. They're on a stage, they're in a theater, they studied or they are archivized, something like that. But there's a kind of, I even think in academic or intellectual life, there's a kind of reluctance to recognize ritual and repetition as joyful. We think it's tedious, it's the same thing, we want to do something new. But you kind of found something there that energized you in the early 60s.
Yes, I think that certain rituals at least, when there are rituals that come from the bottom up to some degree, where there are rituals that express the life of the people rather than rituals that are imposed from the top down, as we see, let's say, political fascistic rituals, some church rituals. So the rituals that come from the bottom up do represent a kind of life force, and they do express a kind of joy, and as well as serving the functions that Turner and Van Gennep and anthropologists have said about moving through life phases. One of the models that I devised at about that time, a little bit later in the mid-70s, which Turner used, was this inverted figure eight, a kind of infinity sign, in which it proposed that life imitates art as much as art imitates life. That we take our models for our social behavior, our personal behavior, from artistic or aesthetic works, that the surface will be life or art, and the conventional thing is that a painting, let's say, is a painting of something in life, but it's the other way around as well. We model ourselves on artistic practices, so that art is to some degree a rehearsal for for our living. So this idea of the dynamic interaction between the realms of art and the realms of ordinary life, or if you will, between aesthetics and ordinary behavior, is something very deep in my theories. I still continue to believe that. And the second essay in that book is called Actuals. So I coined the term actuals as a kind of expansion of what rituals were. And I said that, you know, dancing and ritual making and performing and political action and so on, all of this was the same. And remember that the years that this was forming, there was to think of Abbie Hoffman and Rubin, but others as well, you know, Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers and Malcolm X. There was so much action, let's put it that way, in the streets. And action is another word, it's a theatrical word that Stanislavski made very famous, and, you know, the method of physical actions and so on. So I saw early on, or I felt early on, the kind of conflation or joining of these different realms.
And if I can ask you something, because part of what we're interested in is we're living probably in a moment of great paradigm shifts or challenges. So what you're reading at this point, you're picking up Irving Gottman, you're reading Victor Turner. These are anthropologists, let's say, of everyday life, but this is not really properly in your area of theater studies at that time, right? So you're just picking up ideas, or you're finding something.
Remember, I only have one degree in theater. I have two other degrees. So,
what are the other degrees?
Well, you know, my first degree, my undergraduate degrees, are in English and comparative literature with a minor in psychology. I also was very into philosophy. And then my master's degree is English and creative writing. I was in Paul Engel's writer's workshop at the University of Iowa. At that point, I wanted to become a short story writer and novelist. And I actually have published several short stories. And I even had a poem in the Best American Poetry of 2019, I think, just came out last year. So I did this other stuff. So let's say I turned to making theater from first being a playwright and being very dissatisfied with what I saw on stage. I found the picture stage, the proscenium stage, to be inadequate, to be a reduction, to be old-fashioned in not a good way. And so all of these experiences I've been talking about brought me to making a theater, which I called environmental theater. Another book of mine is called Environmental Theater. And I wasn't the environmental movement, it was environment, as Alan Kaprow, the man who did the first Happenings, coined the word happenings, understood environment. It was like an active art space. And he said that it's the paintings come off the wall and people begin to perform in the galleries. And that was what the happenings were. So that also influenced me. And the thinking of John Cage, that everything is music. In other words, that you want to hear music, just listen. So that those notions were all very, very important to me.
And what's the role of the street and public performance of one's political self, which I always find, like, I'm trying to, because I've been living in the 60s, but I'm kind of think the energy that's in the street of people performing their identity and their right to exist.
There are two or three ways. So also in 1968, I first met Augusta Boal. I was very fortunate that I met some very interesting people at key moments. And I haven't talked about Grotowski. I should talk about him as well. So in 1968, while the proceedings, while the demonstrations were going on in Chicago at the Chicago convention of the Democratic Party, I was in Latin America. And when I was in Brazil, I met Augusta Boal. And he was just forming the ideas that became the theater of the oppressed. And theater of the oppressed is a way of giving voice to people in the streets. And what do we mean in the streets? We mean the public sphere. We mean the public sphere, again, with this bottom-up energy, rather than going into the streets. Like at that point, Joe Papp was going into the streets and bringing Shakespeare to different neighborhoods. That's great, but that's not what I'm talking about. That's a kind of top-down, very nice, and I'm glad for it. I'm not opposed to it. But it still is saying we're going to bring culture to the people rather than taking energy from the people and being partners with the people. So what Boal introduced was the idea is that you present a theatrical situation, which the plot of which, the story of which was something that an ordinary person would think was oppressing her. Let's say she felt at work that her boss was harassing her. So Boal would say, act it out. And then his professional actors would take some of the roles and the ordinary people some of the roles. And then he would say, how would you like to see this done differently? How would you remedy this situation? So although the remedy was in the field of aesthetics, it wasn't an actual remedy at your work, you could see forward into how things might be different. So that's also what art does. Art trades both in memories and in futures and futurities. It trades in memories in the sense like something happened to you and you tell its story, but you also are telling a story, as Shakespeare would say at the end of A Tempest, of a brave new world, of something that would be different. Now, sometimes that is utopic, perhaps as in the Tempest, and sometimes it's dystopic, as in 1984. But in any sense, art is something that expands the line of time. And to say that there is a, Buddhists say we should be in the present center. Art very often says, yes, we should, but the present goes to what we call the past and to what we call the future. All of that is the present in art. So let's just take something everybody knows. Let's take a Van Gogh painting of like Starry Night. So we look at those paintings. Are we looking at southern France? Are we looking at something in the past? Are we looking at something in the continuous present? Are we looking at Van Gogh's own psychology of what he saw, which was, quote, not real by the usual sense, but maybe super real in a certain way? So art can provide us with this. I think of art as very muscular, very active, and it takes its strength from what comes from the bottom up. And like I love Shakespeare and I love the Greeks, and I think both of them, in terms of theater, take their energy from the bottom up.
But I like this idea that you're saying art deals with the past and the present and the future as if there isn't such a rigid distinction.
Correct. And this is what Heisenberg, and this is what quantum theory also tells us. This is what Einstein's general theory of relativity tells us, that time and space are malleable. They're not Newtonianly set. An hour at close to the speed of light is much different than an hour at lower speeds. And so that, and this is an artistic idea. I mean, you can wrap yourself around, you can begin to comprehend a quantum physics, not at the level of the equations, but at the level of a malleability of time and space, and therefore a malleability of experience. And this is what performance studies is to do, that kind of study.
A lot of your interest was through Gottman and Turner in rituals and in repetitions, where actually we have these intensified or slowed down experiences, where we actually think this moment weighs more than another moment. It's sacralized, or it could be sacralized or traumatic. It doesn't, but somehow.
Correct. In other words, if we think of our own lives and we remember an important event, so that event, which may in ordinary clock time be a few minutes, in terms of our experiential time, may occupy a huge amount of our life and determine other things that go on in our life.
Right.
So, and we should not think of it only as in terms of trauma. I think sometimes we take the downers too much. Happy things as well, important things, people who are treasures to us. Do the people who we treasure, who have passed on, ever really die? Not to the people that they've affected. So I'm still in contact with my grandfather. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in an afterlife. I don't believe in a God, but I believe in the presence of my grandfather inside me. I look back at these books, and he was a scholar, so I see him in me. I play chess. He taught me chess. So, and I'm not in any sense unique. Everyone has this, but not everyone takes the time to pay attention to it. And I think we should pay attention to these things.
Can you say something in the beginning of the book, Performance Theory? You really helped me understand something. And you said, it isn't that theater comes out of ritual, kind of pre-modern ritual,
Right.
and there's this kind of pre-modern way we're sort of like running around doing all these ritualistic things in our community, and then theater is the sublimated form of that. You said that is a completely wrong approach.
Yeah, bogus idea, I think.
And that was really helpful for me to think that actually using ritual not as the primitive or less refined version of what art is. I think that's what you broke down in this essay, to say this is not the idea.
Correct. I mean, I was attacking and critiquing a school of thought called the Cambridge Anthropologists, and they were talking about the origins of Greek theater, and they were taking a particular sentence of Aristotle's and blowing it up into, first there was ritual, and then there was art, and we're always celebrating our own time. So they were kind of saying, we are more sophisticated than they were. But my feeling was that their underlying art is the interplay between ritual and play. In other words, play is also very important, and we can trace ritual behavior or ritualization to animal behavior, and we can trace play behavior to animal behavior as well. I mean, who has not seen a dog chase after a ball, or two cats playing? What are they doing? So they are creating alternative realities for themselves. If the two cats are wrestling and playing with each other, one is the cat, one is the mouse for the time being, and then the other one is the cat, the other one is the mouse. So they are performing. So we can go back into the evolutionary tree and find the roots of these behaviors. And ritual tends to be the behavior that becomes fixed and repetitious, and it can be destructive, but it can also be liberating, as Turner did it. And I should tell you how I met him in a little bit. But play is the looser thing. When we say we're fishing and we have a little play in the line, it means the line is not so tight. It can go this way or that way. So there is always the tension between the structure of ritual and the free flow of play. Think of it as a river. So the two banks of the river are the ritual. They contain the water to some degree, but the water itself is turbulent. It's flowing in a certain direction. It's at play. So that there's always this tension and creative interaction between ritual and play.
I actually like this when you use this occasionally, the kind of liminal moment of a wedding ceremony, but I actually like the whole wedding industry, that they have the two shores of this river, but you're trying to create something as unique and meaningful inside of that. And
correct. Well, teaching itself is a liminal occupation. I was attracted to teaching early on for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that if you're a good teacher, you're playing with the material. You have the ritual. That's your syllabus. That's the readings that have to be done. That's the grading that has to be done. That's all that stuff is the ritual. But if you just do that, you're not going to be a great teacher. You're not going to enjoy it. What you take for and enjoy it is the give and take, the play that goes on, the discovery that you make, the digression from the syllabus. All of this stuff is the playful part of teaching. What makes it so difficult these days in Zoomville is that you can have kind of interaction. We're having interaction, but the face-to-faceness of it, we're social animals. We like face-to-faceness. I'll be very happy when we get to some degree to the other side of this pandemic.
When you were saying about teaching, I always feel that when I'm teaching even texts I've read probably for the last 30 years, every year, I still have to reread it the day before, the night before. And so can you say something about, does this relate, and I don't know, I'm just a naive question, to how an actor uses a script, how an actor has lines to follow and everything? Can you say something about that? Because I think as a teacher, I have a book, I have this, I want you to understand Richard Schechner, but then what I come up with today is not going to be what I come up with next week.
Right. Well, the range of acting is so broad. So one kind of acting is exactly that. If I'm doing, let's say, and I've directed Chekhov. So first of all, you get it translated from the Russian into whatever language you're performing it. I've directed Chekhov both in English and in Hindi, but never in Russian. All right, so that's a transformation in itself. A translation is never simply the same as what language it was written in. All right, then the actors memorize those lines, but beyond the lines, they have to give the lines behavior. So you and I are talking, and we're making gestures. Even if we did the same conversation with exactly the same lines, maybe the gestures would change. Again, the minute to minuteness. So, but still, there is at one side of acting, let's say highly scored acting. Let's even compare it to music and dance. So in music, there is, you know, if you're going to be playing a Bach cantata or Beethoven or whatever, you've got to follow the notes. It's scored. If you're in the New York City Ballet, the movement is. But on the other side, even with music, you get to jazz, where there's certain themes and the musician plays with it. Or in dance, you have contact improvisation, where there are rules. So you move from scores to rules. So scores are more on the ritual side, rules are more on the game side. When you move to rules, the rules tell you what you must do and what you cannot do. In between must and cannot, there's the free play and the strategy. When you're on the scored thing, you do what exactly the same. And the glory and the beauty of that is in fulfilling that score. So there's all this range. So you can't theorize directly, completely about acting by saying it is this or it is that. It is something that is at one side more towards the scored, and on the other side more rule bound and free within those rules.
And you include in sort of your range of ritual also sports as an activity.
Yes. Well, I don't see that. It's not just ritual. That range is ritual is one. Ritual on one side, play on the other, and these sports, entertainments, aesthetic genres are in the between. They're not. They all are to some degree ritualized. They all are to some degree played. But ritual as a genre is still underlies them, is different than sports. Sports includes ritualization, but sports obviously includes a lot of play and gaming and gaming as well. You know, chess, for example, has no accidents, but is still play. So it's a very, very interesting category in which, you know, there's a rainy day can affect a football game. A rainy day has no effect on a chess match. A chess match is very mathematical, very bounded, but still it's an infinite number of possibilities, almost an infinite number of possibilities.
What I really liked when you talk about play and sort of on this spectrum of performance from ritual to play, that while you're saying play actually does something important for our lives, it's not a meaningless activity, but at the same time, you don't weigh it down with saying it has this meaning. It actually remains play, which means it's open-ended, contingent, like something can happen, but you're not saying, I'm going to just put all these things into a theory and say, now they all have this great grand meaning we didn't see until now. Although a part of it I found so remarkable when I look at your work, sort of this idea that everyday situations are full of meaning, that we usually just go through the motions and we think we're doing this and we're not even aware that we're exercising a certain kind of part of this performance spectrum. I always think about my students and I always tell them, what are you doing when you're here? And they say, you're very different from when you're not in this classroom. And they said all these identities they take on, or roles they take on.
And we do a lot of things. You know, I put on this shirt. Maybe if I wasn't doing this encounter this morning, I'd be dressed somewhat differently. I know that I'm wearing these suspenders. You have this nice pink shirt on. And Jay asked you to cover the whiteboard with a picture and all. So we're always staging our interactions, even our smallest little interactions. And we're not always conscious of staging them, but we do stage them. In other words, that's, again, Goffman said, the presentation of self in everyday life. We present ourselves and we represent ourselves. And one of the essays, it's not in that book, it's in another book, is called Restoration of Behavior. It's a very key theory of mine. And the restoration of behavior theory, in a nutshell, says two things: that nothing we do is for the first time. It's for the second to the nth time. In other words, we're always reenacting earlier behaviors. From the time we are born to the time we die. We learn things, we do things, we rearrange them, we improvise from them, but it's always from the second to the nth time. And the second thing, very important, that people have commented on a lot, but what they have not so often picked up on is what I think is even more important, that the future creates the past, not the other way around. And what do I mean by that? It's a rehearsal model. In terms of what you want to do today, tomorrow, the performance you want to do tomorrow, you select from what you practiced yesterday to do today, so that constantly your future project is determining what is useful in the past to reenact today to get you to the future you want. Again, it's this notion of time and experience being a bundle, being contained, past, present, and future, not being discrete entities, but interacting with each other.
You said, you earlier mentioned in passing, Austin, this term was from speech-act theory when you encountered it for the first time?
Well, I don't really remember, probably pretty late. After I met Turner, I probably didn't read Austin until the 80s or something like that. How to do things with words. And right. even now, I don't know that. I mean, I know the notion of performative, and it's a very rich notion. But if you ask me what is in chapter 5 of how to do something with words, I don't. I know the idea of performativity and performance, and words do things. When you I thee wed, or when you christen a ship, those are a very, very powerful idea. Let's say these three, and then I want to talk about Grotowski a little bit, because that's interesting to me too and important. But these three thinkers who were important to me. So Turner, the notion of the ritual process, and that's what you were talking about before, that ritual is a process. It's a living thing. It changes. It generates different forms of communitas, of being togetherness. So that's one very important idea.
Sorry, can you just say one thing about this word communitas, because it's so important.
Okay, like, so Turner said that what happens in the ritual state, in the ritual process, is that different kinds of communitas are formed. So one that he called, like, say, normative communitas is what happens, let's say, in the Roman Catholic Church with communion. So it's established, it's supposed to happen. You may feel something, you may not feel anything, but it's a communitas of the communion. It's called communion. You're one with the body and flesh of Christ, etc. But it's normative, it's imposed on you. On the other side is what he called spontaneous communitas. And spontaneous communitas, an example he would give is, let's say you're dancing, and all of a sudden you're dancing on the dance floor, a whole group of people and the music, and you feel one with everybody. And that's a kind of spontaneous communitas. And what Csikszentmihalyi, Csikszentmihalyi, a sociologist, called flow. So you're in the flow. So that communitas can be rigid and established by orthodoxy, or it can be very, very fluid and brought about by extraordinary experiences. We've all had flow experiences where the distance between the thing done and the doer, between you and what you're doing, has collapsed, and you are the act. As certain dancers have said, the dance danced me. I didn't dance the dance. So that's another kind of communitas. So Turner was very interested in the experiential kinds and the conditions that would yield especially spontaneous communitas. So that's Turner. So and Goffman is the presentation of self in everyday life. And then the notion of the performative, the words that do things, the things that are extremely powerful. Grotowski, I don't know if you know much about Jerzy Grotowski. He was a great Polish theater director. I was instrumental in bringing him to the United States for the first time. And also TDR, when I edited it back in Tulane, published the first essays by and about him ever published in English. He was known in Poland, but not even known in the rest of Europe and not in the English-speaking world. So I was instrumental in bringing him to the attention of people. And he would deconstruct classic texts, and he would stage things not on the stage. But for example, when he did Dr. Faustus, he had a table and no, this was Constant Prince. He had a table at Calderon's Constant Prince, and it all took place on this table, and the people sat around the table, the spectators. At any rate, he developed a theory of acting in which one acted oneself as well as acting the character together. Took Stanislavski much further, and I studied with him. I was instrumental in bringing him, and he gave his first workshop in the New World at NYU in 1967, October, November 1967. And I was a member of that workshop. I joined the students. I refused. They wanted me. The dean at that time, David Oppenheim, and J. Michael Miller, who went to school with me, said, no, you can watch. I said, no, I don't want to watch. I want to do it. And I prevailed. So it was very important that I actually did his work with him. And
so what was it like?
He affected what became Dionysus in '69.
What was that class like for you? What did you actually, when you were a student?
I learned certain psychophysical exercises based on what he had learned in India and China, and at Kathakali and yoga. I learned the idea that the performer need not give up the self, that the performer was more like the novelist than the paintbrush. In other words, a paintbrush is an instrument in the hand of the painter, and the result is what's on the canvas. And that was the classical way of thinking of an actor. An actor became the character. You didn't, but Grotowski said, no, the actor never ceases being the actor. It's like a first-person novel. The novel may tell a story, and it may be fictional, and but the novelist is present in the novel. You know, you get a sense of who Hemingway is if you read Farewell to Arms, et cetera, et cetera. So he brought that into the theater, and that finally, you know, for me, I did a series of performances. Dionysus is a very good example. When Finley says, you know, I am Bill Finley, I'm a god. That's kind of working out some of the ideas of Grotowski, taking them even further than Grotowski, because Grotowski never had the people use their own names. But I developed that, and then with Spalding Gray later, he took it still further. I directed him in many of his early pieces. And so the notion of the dialectic between the character and the action and the personal, the person of the performer. And that's where we started to use the word performer rather than actor. So a lot of that came from Grotowski.
When you picked the Baki on Dionysus, which is a story about a god who arrives, but his family disputes that he's a god. They say he's just human. It seemed, when I watched it, it's actually, for our listeners or viewers, the Hemispheric Institute has the full recording up online. And it's very troubling to watch today, sort of in terms of, because he becomes this political leader, and at the end of the play, he actually says, I will be the president, and sort of this idea of
the Hitler salute, right?
That's right, and the larger than life person who we kind of want, I think we all sort of want someone to look up to and think he's maybe special or sort of ordained in some way, anointed. So you chose this, why did you choose this piece to start to think about this?
You know, the history of me and the Baki goes quite far. The first scholarly essay I ever had published, which I wrote while I was in the Army in 1957, was published in the Tulane Drama Review before I was connected with it. I just sent it to it. It was called Young King, Jealous God, and it was an analysis of the Baki. So it was so the Baki has been with me since my undergraduate days, and I liked the Baki very much because it seemed to tell both a personal story and a political story at the same time. Of course, Antigone does, a lot of the Greek plays do, but the Baki in a way in which it's also about drunkenness and madness. It's not simply that his family denies that Dionysus is a god. He decides to possess the women and send them to the mountainside of Kithaeron, where they will dance and do, quote, orgies, whatever it is. They're doing something the men don't like and don't know. And I've always been fascinated with female power, particularly. I come from I won't get too personal about it, but I come from a family mainly I have three brothers, one of whom has passed away, three others of us still here. So I had three brothers, a grandfather, a father, and my mother. She was the only woman in the household. There was all these men. So women were, what were these creatures? So that the Baki kind of showed me a certain kind of vision of women gone wild and mad, and also this notion of the arrogance of Pentheus, the king, not kind of like Oedipus, but Oedipus is dignified, and Oedipus, we think of it as mature. He probably is only in his 30s if you do the chronology, but still he's fully developed. And Tiresias tells Oedipus, don't seek this, and we know it's going to happen. And it sets itself up. There's no laughter. But with Pentheus, he's only about 15. He just was there. Tiresias goes out and dances, and so does Cadmus, his grandfather, and he doesn't know how to handle this. So it's a kind of farce tragedy. And that's what I saw in the streets around me. That's why I was, interested in Abbie Hoffman. It's a farce tragedy. We were enacting in the 60s something that was Brechtian, fun, funny, and tragic all at once. And the Baki is the one Greek play that gives us all of that. It's Euripides' last play. He was already a very old man when he wrote it, so he's looking back. But it has this ecstatic energy, this vibrant energy, and yet Dionysus destroys them all. Let's hope we don't live that life. He destroys the entire city, and then he goes off to wreck other Greek cities. So it's funny, it's laughing, but it's laughing on the way to hell. So it's a very complex play, and that's why I like it so much.
And when you did it on Worcester Street, at the end,
the performing garage is still there. It's still being used by the woman who was my assistant director at one point, Liz Lecomte, who also I directed in several plays. She's the head of the Worcester group. It's still there.
So it still exists, and then at the end of the play, it goes into the street. And can you say something about the space of theater, like a physical space? Because you write a lot about this idea.
Yeah, well, the performing garage was a black cube before they had black cubes. It was literally about 50 by 50 by 20 feet high. And each production, I made a totally different environment in it. So for Dionysus, there were two towers facing each other. I have a model of one over here in the room I could show it to you. There were two towers facing one another, and the audience was sitting on these towers and on carpets on the floor, and the performance took place everywhere. And
can you really get us the model? Do you really have a model there?
I can get it.
Oh, I love this.
This model was made by Jerry Rojo. It was a design of Michael Kirby, who was a faculty member at NYU. So there were two of these, and they faced each other so that the actors would be on these and the audience as well, but they would be on the floor and on different platforms before them. So it was a theater like it had never been seen in New York or pretty well anywhere before, because it didn't have any stage. And when people came into the theater, I didn't admit them together. If you came, let's say, Uli, you came with somebody, I would say, are you two together? And you would say, yes. I said, okay, you go to the back of the line, your friend can go in. And you'd say, no, we came together, I want to go in together. I said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. But would you like to see the manager of the theater? And they'd say, yes. So I'd go inside the door of Worcester Street, and I'd come back out. I said, I'm the manager. And they
So they were already involved in the play, and you already directed them.
And why I broke people up is this. So you go in and you see the stranger, there are no seats. And a person on the other side of the door says, hello, sir, can I take you to your seat? Or hello, ma'am, can I take you to your seat? But he keeps saying that. He never takes anybody anywhere. So you find a place and you sit down. Let's say if you're brave, you get and sit way up here. If you're a little bit more timid, you go into the background someplace. But then when your friend comes in, you're looking for him. You're looking for her or him. When he comes in the door, you say, hey, Joe, I'm over here. And Joe is looking in. So that's the way I got people to really engage with the space.
Oh, great.
They had to find each other. They had to look for each other. They had to seek each other. So you couldn't come out in a regular theater, look, I'm row 7, seat 6, and just sit. You had to be engaged in it. So that also, this was my first year of teaching at NYU. It was in June 68. I started in September 67. It was the end of the academic year. But at that point, I had already done this kind of theater in New Orleans. So I brought it here, but it meshed with my work, with my teaching at NYU, because I was teaching courses at NYU in contemporary performance. And it was my first year, so I here. So I was just beginning to engage students in the School of the Arts about this kind of thing.
And since we said earlier that art sort of engages the past and the future, so you take an ancient Greek play, you're putting it in contemporary New York. Did you think at that moment, did you have any sense this was going to be something, go somewhere, mean something 51 years later, or did you just think, I'm doing this now?
You do and you don't. To be honest about it, I think every artist thinks that when they do something, it's forever, right?
Maybe
that's your illusion, or your hope, or your dream. So, but you also know that that's just a hope, an illusion, and a dream, that it probably won't turn out that way. So when this became so successful, because it got a fabulous review of the New York Times the next day, we never had an empty seat. We ran it for a year. We could have run it for longer, but I wanted to do other things. And then Brian became interested because Bill Finley, who played Dionysus, although we rotated the roles, but he played Dionysus most of the time. He was a friend of De Palma, who has been in earlier De Palma films. And De Palma was still a young man. Dionysus was only, I think, his third or fourth film. He hadn't made Carrie yet. So when he became interested, he came to see it, and he actually came to see it and then said, I'm going to film it right near the end of the run. So on the very last night, he filmed it. And then the next day, he said, well, I don't know, I can't get it developed. This was before video. I mean, it was celluloid. He said, what if it doesn't come out? I can't use it. I said, well, you know, the play's closed. He said, no, we got to do another performance, and we have to have brighter lights. I said, but so he was teaching at Sarah Lawrence, or Finley was. And so we had a second show where we invited the students from Sarah Lawrence to come for free. We turned the lights up brighter, and we shot it a second time. So if you look at the film carefully, you'll see some of it looks dark and some of it looks light, because we needed to shoot it a second time just to make sure that we had it. And then I think it was me, it may have been De Palma, who had the idea of this double screen, like I'm looking at you in Zoom, we're in a double screen, the split screen, because how to get the idea of this kind of interaction that would take place on the stage, not like a picture frame stage. So the idea of having the double screen was very, very, very good.
Richard, there's something else I really wanted to ask you about over with the idea of performance. You work in India, especially. I think that's sort of a key part. Can you say, and actually I just thought of something, every artist thinks they're going to last forever, except the Burning Man style. And one of the Indian, where they burn it all at the end, right? So,
right. Well, yes, they burn. I've been to Burning Man, and they do burn the man. But believe me, they don't burn a lot of the other things. They also burn the temple. They burn two things at the end of Burning Man: the man, and then the next day the temple. But that, you know, so art is ephemeral as well as permanent. India has been very, very important to me. Not only India, my travels to many, many parts of the world. I mean, I've been to every continent but Antarctica. My work in Papua New Guinea was very important to me, Australia, many places. But India has a special kind of meaning for me. So I went to India first in 1971, and I studied yoga there very seriously with a great yoga teacher, Krishnamachari. And I returned to India many, many times to study the various performances and to make an in-depth study of the Ramlila of Ramnagar, which is a 31-day play that takes place all through the town of Ramnagar, which is very near the sacred city of Benares or Varanasi. It has many different names. So, and that's an environmental theater that moves from place to place in this town and takes 31 days to enact, each day in the afternoon and in the evening. So it's a fabulous performance. I've written quite a bit about it as well. And I've taken more than 8,500 photographs, which are in an archive at Bope's library. So it's the largest collection of photographs of this particular performance, and also some films. So those photographs will be made open to the public on art stores as soon as I finish a book I'm doing about the Ram Leela, so that people can see those photographs. And they go back. I went to Ram Leela for the first time in 1978 and the last time in 2014. So I have a very big longitudinal experience of that performance.
And you're not just a spectator when you go there, right? You feel
nobody can be just a spectator. But
yeah.
I was photographing. But for believing Hindus, they are seeing actual gods. They believe in the incarnation of gods in the bodies of 5 pre-pubescent boys: the god Rama, the god Sita, and then Rama's brothers, Bharat, Lakshman, and Shatrughan. They think that these are the actual gods. So they touch their feet. They take lotus leaves and tulsi leaves from their hands. They worship them in the temple ceremony. The Maharaja, the king of the place, he's no longer a real king. India is not a royal place anymore, but he's still regarded as the Maharaja because he sponsors this performance. So it's a very complex interaction between, again, everyday life, ritual life, play, and performance. So it's a paradigm, if you talk of paradigms, of the kind of performance I've championed for my whole life.
I'm going to ask you a question in conclusion. It's a little difficult because it's not possible to really answer, but you came out of actually doing theater, then being politically involved, and also being a scholar and an academic and a writer, and then you became your teacher. So you're spanning these different areas. For people today, and I think a lot of people are thinking, how do we shift? There are certain things that have to be shifted about climate change, a kind of awareness of that. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, they're all not just fixing a little thing in the existing system, but rethinking the entire thing. If you talk to people today, what do you think people should be doing? I mean, you read so widely, you worked with so many people, you allowed yourself to be inspired by such different...
I wrote something very recently, which perhaps should be attached to this, called Endgame Clinging to Hope. So it really was published a few months before the pandemic, but it's about climate change. And it starts with Beckett's Endgame and certain things from there. And it ends with John Cage about overpopulation in art. And it deals with the climate change. And part of what I feel now is that the COVID is a kind of rehearsal for climate change. And in the sense that we're not yet coping very well with the COVID, is not a good harbinger for what we might do as climate change comes. The difficulty for us with climate change, us meaning the species, is that we are, for the most part, a short-sighted species. We can't see in terms of dozens of years and so on. We're worried about putting food, figuratively speaking, food on our table tonight. So, and climate change happens in a kind of slow motion, but ineluctably. But I still cling to hope. I feel a kind of contradiction that I've had for a long time between what my belly feels and what my head thinks. So my head is not too optimistic, because I see that we're not, even the Paris Accords will not stop what's coming, that there'll be a huge amount of surge of people from particularly the global south and places, Bangladesh and so on, which with climate change are, New York and Venice may be able to build a seawall, but Dhaka will not be able to build a seawall. Southern Florida, maybe certain parts, but lots of southern Florida is going to go underwater. What's going to happen? There'll be a huge pressure of people. There'll be a strain, but I feel we'll finally adjust. But we may enter a period of extraordinary stress, and I think that what's happened now with the pandemic is a kind of harbinger of that kind of stress. What is happening now is not going to be the last time that this kind of challenge to our
Mhm.
social fabric will come. The question is, will we respond to it in a creative way, in a loving way, in a way that can avoid what happened to Europe after the fall of Rome? Remember, from the second or third century on, as Rome began to crumble, what happened in the north of Europe in the Roman Empire, not the East, but the Western Roman Empire, was once called the Dark Ages. And of course, there were lots of good things that were going on throughout that period, but it was also a very hard period. It had the bubonic plague, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, are we going to be able as a species, as a human community, to avoid a new dark age? I don't have the answer to that. But I do feel that if we face the truth, if we look at the past and realize it is continuous with the present and the future, we have a possibility to go forward. In the most immediate way, I know we only have a few minutes left. We're coming to an election. I'm talking to you on October 26th. Tomorrow is 1 week from the American election. The American election has global repercussions. And I hope for a peaceful transferal of power, and I hope for a change in our fundamental policies regarding climate, regarding race and injustice, the whole package. Again, my belly is hopeful, my head sees possibilities that are not so hopeful. So that's where I stand, a certain kind of ambivalence.
But I really, Richard, I appreciate you actually saying your belly is hopeful, and your work to me is so remarkable because you really talk about the human condition, but it's very specific. But it's not in nationalities or languages or traditions or genres. You're saying this is who we are, and then you take these really precise examples and illuminate something about that condition. And I wonder whether for climate change, something like that is needed to say it's addressing all of humanity, but we have to be very precise because otherwise people can't connect to.
Yes, we do. But the question, for humans is, do we need to learn our lesson, or can we perform our lesson through rehearsal and learn it before we have to experience it? So when my belly is hopeful, it's the rehearsal, what the scientists are telling us, what the climate is telling us, should be enough to make us want to avoid the experience. And if it is not, nature will teach us.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you, Richard, for this sort of, you're the kind of, I feel like you're the future of performance studies. I really like this talk. So. Yeah, no, it's great. I really like this. I really like this a lot. And I have to say that you started out by saying, you're doing as well as everybody else. I've been doing great because I've been able to reread all of your work and watch your lectures and performances online. So I just recommend to people to do that because the pleasure and vitality you tap into is just amazing, I think, in all the work you've done.
Thank you. Thank you, Uli, for this opportunity, and Jay for this opportunity. You conducted it was great to have this dialogue with you, and I hope people find it useful.
And I hope we'll be able to meet in person soon.
Really? Yes. Let's get some coffee or a glass of wine. Enjoy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Richard. Okay. Thank you.